Montana Territory, spring of 1885. The outpost at Red Bluff sat on the ragged edge of the trail. Where pine roots began to split, the earth dust hung in the air like it didn't know where else to go. Smoke from cook fires drifted, loath smell of horses, sweat and old tobacco pressed into everything at the edge of town. Simeon had hammered together a makeshift platform, planks nailed to wagon crotches. A crowd gathered in front of it. Men with tired boots and hollower hearts, they'd come to trade livestock. Toulson at the bitter end, something human. She stood barefoot on the platform, ankles kissed with trail dust. Rough cloth swaddled her head and mouth, turned from some forgotten sack. Sun-bleached wind frayed, clinging to her like old shamanly. Her eyes showed steady and distant, lightless pools of hazel that gave nothing back. Her wrists were bound, knotted tight and trembling, just so she hadn't spoken since Idath. He said not a word, not a name. The man running the auction wore a weathered burgundy vest and a rusted badge that barely hung on his chest. He slammed his gavel under the crate beside him. All right, last one for the day, he called. Ain't got no name, ain't shown her face. Says she'll work, says she'll obey. Starting bids $1. He looked over. The crowd was full enough of whiskey to take on the riddle in a corset. A ripple of laughter broke out. But she's a cactus in disguise, prickly and full of secrets, Samini called out. Or maybe just a sack of laundry with opinions. Another laughage go on. Mary the bed sheet, she's got about as much to say. Someone cackled. A few men turned away. Others elbowed each other, waiting for someone foolish enough to raise a hand. She didn't move. Her hands hung loose, wrists rubbed raw. The sack shifted only with her breathing, quick, shallow, steady. Her fingers clenched and relaxed in small rhythms, controlled but not calm. The auctioneer frowned. She's no good to anyone if she won't even speak. Still no one moved. Then the crowd parted. A man walked forward. Tall coat, dusty at the cuffs, boots heavy with dried mud. The brim of his tan-colored trail hat shaded his physique. His shoulders were wide, his steps. Even one hand was wrapped in leather strips, the kind earned by rope and heat, not accident. He didn't speak until he reached the front. $1, he said. The air shifted. You sure? The auctioneer didn't even want to see what you're buying. The man looked at the woman. She hadn't so much as flinched. I ain't buying a face, he said. I'm marrying a person. Even the wind went still. The auctioneer licked his lips. Name? Luke Thatcher, Cowboy, lives east of Red Bluff. Auctioneer scribbled on the ledger and slid a page forward. Luke signed it without a word. Then the auctioneer turned toward the figure in the sack. You're now legally wed, miss. Say your name for the record. The crowd shifted. A few leaned in at first. There was nothing. Then behind the cloth a voice emerged, dry, faint but firm enough to carry Willem Mercer. Luke's hands stilled just a flicker, then his jaw set and he looked at her. Didn't speak, didn't ask. He stepped up to the platform, reached gently for her arm and untied the ropes, biting into her wrists before leading her down. Not a single man jeered, not a laugh, not a word. Only the sound of boots creaking on dry planks and a name that hung in the air like a secret. Returning home, Willem Mercer. The trail leading out of Red Bluff narrowed fast, us giving way to pine needles and packed earth. Sunlight barely made it through the canopy, and what did came soft and slanted like it wasn't sure. It was welcome. Luke Thatcher walked ahead, boots steady, leading a mule loaded with suppliage. Didn't look back behind him. William Mercer followed in silence. The sack still covered her head, but her steps were careful, not weak. Her hands, now unbound, stayed clasped in front of her like she wasn't quite sure what to do with freedom. Yet they walked for over an hour. No words passed between them, just the quiet breath of pine trees and the sound of old leather shifting with every step. Then the woods opened up to a clearing carved into the hillside. There stood the cabin, built from dark-cut timber, small but squared to the wind. It looked like it had been there for years and expected to stay. A stack of firewood leaned against the side wall. A rusted horseshoe hung above the door frame, bent and split at one end. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Luke stepped up to the door and pushed it open. The interior was clean, Titone room. One cot, a table, a chair, a stove, and a basin. The hearth was cold but ready. He stepped back and said quietly, ain't no one telling you where to be now. That's yours to do, said. Willa entered slowly. She didn't speak, didn't reach for anything. She crossed to the far wall, crouched low with her back to the room, and rested her hands on her niche. Stayed facing away. Luke didn't say a word. He placed his hat on a hook near the door and moved to the stove. He set a small pile of kindling and coaxed flame from it. A pot was filled and a few scraps were added, dried root, a bit of meat, some leaf The scent came slow and warm, smoke, salt, spice, the kind of food made for long silence. Didn't glance toward her, just ladled the stew into 2 bowls. One he set gently near her without a sound. The other he placed on the table. Then he sat and waited. Minutes passed. Then came her voice, muffled but steady. What is this? Luke stirred his bowl once. Meal for the last one standing. There was a pause, then the sound of her shifting. I used to make it for myself, said after the war, after long days with no one talking. Then I started making 2 bowls even when there wasn't anyone there. She turned her head just slightly. On the chair beside Luke sat a second bowl, steam still rising, no one else in the room. I used to set it for my wife, said quietly. She passed from fever one spring, quiet and quick. She was brave to the end. He kept setting it out just to remind myself. I made it home again. He looked toward the hearth. No, I set it for her and for you. Willa said nothing. Then she reached for the bowl. Her hand trembled as she brought the spoon beneath the sacchating. Without removing it, her movements were small, deliberate, tactious, but she finished every bite later. While Luke washed the bowls in a tin basin, remained by the wall, arms around her knees. Still watching. She hadn't spoken since, but for the first time she wasn't hiding from the room. And somewhere in the quiet something had shifted. The fire in the hearth cracked low, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. Luke Thatcher sat with his elbows on his knees, staring into the coal. Hadn't lit a lantern. The fire was enough outside. Wind moved through the trees like breath in a sleeping chest. Long, slow, and old. Didn't look toward her. He didn't have to. She still sat by the far wall. Her knees were drawn up beneath her chin. The sack remained over her head, but she hadn't touched the door. Hadn't tried to leave. Luke's jaw worked. Quiet lie. Rubbed his palms together once, then leaned closer to the fire. It had been for years a winter thicker than any before, the kind that stripped bark from trees and frostbit bone through wool. He had ridden to far north chasing timber he couldn't afford to lose. Pride had driven him past the safe-cut Linish. Didn't turn back when he should have. He remembered slipping snow packed hard beneath his bootless leg, twisted beneath him sharp and final. By the time he'd crawled into the drift, there was no trail left to follow. He remembered thinking, this is how men vanish. But then hands rough, fast, alive, had been dragged, pain lighting up his whole body into blackness. And then fire. He'd opened his eyes to a flickering cavice at the entrance. Heat on his face, something herbal in the air, bitter boiled. Olivia across from him sat a woman. Her face was veiled in coarse sackcloth, drawn tight and knotted at the neck, with only her eyes left to meet the world. Still shadowed and silent, her coat was patched leather and threadbare wool. Her hands moved quickly as she poured a ladle of dark liquid into a tin cup. You don't need to know who I am, she had said, but I'm not going to let you. Hadn't spoken. Couldn't she? Press the tin into his hands. Its pine bark and dry lichen drink. He had it burned going down, but it kept his breath from slowing. She wrapped his leg, braced it with hot stones, and kept the fire fed. She moved like someone used to being invisible, quite constant. He remembered fading in and out, fever, pain, cold, trying to pull him under. When he woke again, she was gone. The cave was cold but safe. The fire was still lit, and beside it, folded with strange care, was a square of cloth stitched with purple flowers in uneven thread. No larger than a hand. He'd kept it. It lived in the lining of his coat, where even the worst days couldn't wear it out. And now 3 years later, the voice that had spoken on that auction platform, William Mercer, was the same voice that had whispered over that tin coupon the snow. Same rhythm, same weight, same stillness. Didn't need proof, not after all this time. He reached inside his coat pocket. His fingers closed around the cloth. He didn't pull it out, just held it there behind him. She shifted slightly, the sack rustling. She still hadn't spoken. He didn't turn asterisk, but in the space between the hearth and the wall, between the years behind and the room around them, Luke Thatcher made a quiet decision. He wouldn't ask her to admit it. He wouldn't make her relive what she hadn't offered, but he would not let her vanish again. Mist hugged the roots of the tree, skirling low and silver against the earth. High above, a few crows cut silent paths through the morning sky. The sun filtered in, late, hesitant between the peninsula. Mercer stepped out alone. She crossed the porch, past the empty wash basin, past the mule still dozing near the post, and made her way toward the tall pine that stood at the edge of the clearing like a quiet guardian. She wore the sack still tied loose, not choking. Its hem fluttered faintly in the breeze. Her steps were slower, steadier, her spine no longer bent inward at the base of the tree. Face toward the break in the trees where light touched the clearing's edge. With both hands She reached behind her neck, the knot came underneath, sack slid upward, revealing her nose, her mouth, the curve of her cheek. Let the air touch her skin. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't surrender, it was something in between. Back at the side of the cabin, Luke Thatcher knelt beside a wooden basin, oiling the teeth of his saw. He didn't move. When she came into view, didn't speak right away, then without looking up said, got turned around once. Deep winter. Near Black Ram. His hand passed once over the blade, broke my leg, thought that was it, thought I'd die out there. Willa didn't speak, she stared at the moss near her feet. But someone found me, Luke say, dragged me into a cave, built a fire, fed me bitter tea that tasted like bark, kept me alive. He set the saw down gently and looked over, not directly at her, but near, wore a sack over her head. He said, didn't tell me her name, hardly said a thing. A breath passed, but I remember her voice. There was a stillness, then it fear, not guilt, just a stillness. Then the sound of Fabriquilla pulled the sack the rest of the way off and dropped it in her lap. Her face was not monstrous, not hidden behind ruin, but along her left cheek ran a scar, deep, curved, and permanent from temple to jaw, like something had tried to carve the truth out of her and failed. She looked up. The man who ran the boarding house where I work, she said, voice level, told me I could keep my room if I gave. Maresh paused. I said no. Her hands gripped the folded sack, her knuckles were pale. He came at me. I fought back, slipped, hit the stove, didn't get up. Luke didn't move. He said, I lured him, said I planned it, that I killed him on purpose. Sesh swallowed hard, but I think someone saw. I remember a shadow near the door, a woman in the kitchen. She looked away, she stared past him, now into the woods. There were no witnesses who spoke, no one who stood up. She looked down at her hands. A Gangthy called me a liar, a temptress, a killer. Luke rose, slow and quiet. He sold me off to pay his debts. She continued past me from one hand to another like cattle, covered my face so no one would see the scar, so they wouldn't decide what I was worth before I even opened my mouth. Her voice wavered, but she didn't break. I didn't ask to be saved, she said, and I didn't ask to be bought. She looked up at him fully now. But I'm tired of hiding. Luke didn't step toward her. He didn't try to take the sack or her hand. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, and said, thank you for telling me. His voice was quiet but steady. You didn't have to, but you did. She blinked once hard, but no tears. Communly breath, and in that breath something let go for the first time since she stepped onto that auction stage. She was no longer a shadow. She was Willa Mercer, and she was no longer hiding. Light moved softly across the floorboards, golden through the window above the table. Dust hung in the air like quiet movement stirred by nothing, the kind of morning where stillness didn't feel empty, it felt earned. William Mercer rose from the cot slowly. Her hair had come loose during the night, curling gently at her shoulder. She no longer reached for the sack. It wasn't near the bed, it hadn't been folded, it hadn't been needed. She stepped lightly across the room, expecting the usual, a bowl, a tin cup, a wash rag by the basin. Instead, something new waited for her. On the table sat a small mirror, oval, silver-edged, aged at the corners, but carefully cleaned. It was propped against a smooth wedge of pine, angled toward the light so that the rising sun poured gently over it. Beside it lay a scarf, faded, dust-colored silk, folded with quiet precision. No gesture to say it was hers, just the mirror and the scarf waiting. Willa stopped. She didn't reach for them, not yet. The fire in the stove had gone low. The room was silent, but not cold. Outside, birds began to call from the tree somewhere. Water dripped from a pine bough. A breeze passed through the half-open window. Approach. She had never needed glass to know her face. The scar was no stranger, it was a path she had memorized with her fingertips, felt in darkness, measured in silence. Sat and looked, not with dread, not with defiance, with a kind of stillness that comes. What will you do with it now? She looked around to the trail, to the arch rising behind the Cabinto. The world she no longer had to outrun. I'll keep it, she said, not as a burden, but as a testament. This brow lifted just slightly. A testament to what? Her smile was calm, almost reverent. That what once bound me has no power now that the yoke was broken, and I walked free by my own choosing. The days that followed were quieter, for it was gone. The trap had worked, but justice on paper was still unfinished. Back at the cabin, Willa hung her laundry with bare hands, no gloves, no veil. Her dress fluttered in the wind. Simple, well-mended hearse. Inside, Luke worked at the table with a chisel, carving a final detail into the top beam of the arcade built outside. The linen that would hang from it lay folded nearby, edges weighted with river stone. Didn't rush the work, every line had its place. Willa passed behind him carrying a tin of clothespins. Neither said much. They didn't have to. Then late that morning, a rider appeared at the edge of the woods. It was the sheriff. Dust clung to his coat. His horse was sweating and in his hand held loose, but certain was a sealed envelope. Pellick met him near the gate. No ceremony, no question. Sheriff handed over the letter, tipped his hat, and turned to ride back the way he came. Luke stood still for a moment, the envelope heavy in his grip. Then he walked it inside. What Willa didn't yet know was that Anna Turner had written a letter of her own, 3 pages of plain, spoken truth, signed with a steady hand. She'd once looked away in a kitchen doorway, but she didn't look away this time. She swore to what she saw, mailed it to the courthouse. In Helena herself. Sometimes justice doesn't move until a woman shoves it forward. Anna shoved inside. Willa stood at the mirror. Her scarf lay draped on the chair. Behind her hair unbound, hands still didn't reach for the sack. There was no need. Luke entered quiet. He held the envelope out, saying nothing. She took at her fingers, trembled only once as she slid her thumb beneath the seal. She unfolded the paper and read the words, first silently, then aloud. Charges against Willa Mercer dropped. Case closed. Warrant rescinded. She stared at the letter for a long moment. Then she folded it slow and careful and stepped outside. She passed the wood pile, past the split log bench, walked out toward the clearing at the edge of the woods, where for upright beams stood beneath the open sky. Luke had just set the last nail into the base of the arch. The linen cloth was already hung. It moved slightly in the breeze, catching threads of sunlight between shadow. Willa stood beside it, the letter still in her hand. She didn't credit and smile right away either. She just breathed, and for the first time since she was sold to silence, her breath came without weight behind her. Luke straightened and wiped the sawdust from his palms without turning. She said, "I want to use the sack." Luke's brow furrowed slightly. "You sure?" She nodded. "Not the way it was, not to hide. I want to make something from it." She turned to him. "Something I choose." Spring had come fully now. The trees wore green. Without apology, wold flowers pushed up through the rocks. The wind no longer whispered warnings. It carried warmth. Cabins sat calm beneath the pines. The arch Luke had built stood at the clearing's edge, linen swaying softly from its crossbeam. No decorations, no banners, just light and space. They didn't send word across town. They didn't call a crowd, but the people who mattered came anyway. Anna Turner walked up the ridge path wearing a cotton dress that didn't match anything, but her spirit carried a small bouquet of yellow bells. The old blacksmith from Red Bluff brought a jug of applejack, and the town baker brought bread wrapped in a worn calico cloth. They were not many, but they were enough. Inside the cabin, Willa Mercer stood in front of the mirror. Her dress was cream muslin, hand-stitched, not fancy, but flawless in its honesty. She'd sewn it over 3 nights. Needle, steady, breath slow on her head. She wore a veil. It had once been a sash, and Luke had washed it together, soaked it in sun, and trimmed its edges with white thread, the kind meant to hold old fabric together without showing the stitches in each corner. Embroidered faint purple wildflowers, the same shape as the ones on the cloth shed left behind years ago in the snow. It no longer resembled something meant to erase a persona. It looked like something claimed. When she stepped outside the forest, Pousid Luke waited beneath the arch, his hair combed back, his boots scrubbed clean, wore his only shirt without sap stains. It hung stiff on his shoulders, but the way he stood in it made it fit. He saw her and everything else of the wind, the trees, the sky fell quiet. She walked toward him without hesitation, not like someone being given away, but like someone who had chosen this moment with her whole self. When she reached him, he took her hands in his. "No matter what cover your face," he said, "you were always the woman I chose." He looked into her eyes. "And now you're the woman I vow to stand beside to the end." Willa smiled, not with the caution of someone testing hope, but with the quiet peace of someone who had finally stopped running. "I vow the same," she said. There was no priest, no scripture, just them, the trees, people who stayed when others didn't. They kissed, soft, certain, and the linen above them caught the wind like a sail ready to lift. A few drops of rain fell light as breath. No one moved to shelter. Anna leaned in toward the blacksmith and baker and said under her breath, "Never thought I'd see a burlap sack turned into a wedding veil." The blacksmith smiled and answered, "Ain't the sack, it's what she turned it into that night." As the fire cracked low and laughter faded into birdsong, Willa sat beside Luke on the porch. The veil lay folded in her lap. Her fingers traced the embroidered edges. "This used to mean everything I feared," said Luke. Looked over at her, and now she smiled. "No, it means everything I chose." He reached for her hand. Their fingers wove together. They sat that way until the stars came out in the woods, once a place of silence, and shadows held them gently like a home earned, rather than given, and so beneath the tall pines with a veil born of shame, turned into a crown of her own making. William Mercer and Luke Thatcher found what so many on the frontier never did: peace, not in forgetting, but in reclaiming. Their love didn't erase the past, it didn't heal every scar, but it turned what once hurt them into something that could bless them, because sometimes in the hard country, where stories break, survival isn't